So, great to see you here. I hope it's not too tiresome. I got a coffee just before. I hope you did the same. Today, I want to connect a little bit to what the other challenges regarding energy has been talking about, because there are a lot of synergies that we can find here between them. And before I start, I should probably introduce these people sitting on stage so that they don't sit here in silence. So we have Magnus from Vattenfall, Gadi from SolarEdge, and Max also from Vattenfall. We will talk to them a little bit more later. But first, 41%. This is the number from IEA of total global emissions coming from electricity and heat generation. That's the reason why I'm here. And I guess this is the reason why some of you are here as well, because we want to change this. This should be zero, right? And we want to move to, if we want to move to a fossil-free future, decarbonizing the electricity system is going to be key. And Vattenfall, we work in all of these areas of emissions. We have the electricity up top, but we are also active in industry with fossil-free steel. We work in transportation with electric vehicles and charging stations. So I think we're in a pretty good position to sort of fuel this transition. But today we're going to focus on the electricity and heat generation. Before we go into the challenge, we should talk a little bit about how the power system works. Because to sort of understand what we're proposing, we need all to be on the same level. And every moment in time, power generation have to be equal to power demand, all across Europe and the world. This means that if I turn off the light in here, generation somewhere in Europe has to decrease. Now, a light doesn't make much difference, but imagine I was using a fast charger for an electric vehicle or a heat pump. That impact is something that will impact the power system. And if we have more electric chargers and heat pumps, the impact will, of course, be larger. And we have done this balancing of the power system for as long as the power system has been in operation. It's been working fine. We balance the grid with hydropower or gas-fired power plants, and this has meant that the power system works as it should. And this balancing is what we call flexibility, making sure that the frequency of the power system, the generation versus the consumption, is always the same. This is done by, for example, big industry players decreasing their consumption when necessary, or for power plants to increase or decrease their production. So we've had flexibility for so long, but what is the problem now? Why is this a problem? Why does this come up now? Well, when we introduce new types of generation that's dependent on weather that we can't plan like wind power and solar power, there is a need to fill the gap of the when there's no wind or no solar, or when we think there's going to blow but actually it doesn't. So we need to fill that gap with some kind of production or a decrease in consumption. And this is, since we of course want to move to the fossil-free power system, we want to put as many wind turbines and solar parks as we can out in the system. But this means that the need for flexibility is going to increase. So the problem that this means leads to, so to say, is that generation. When generation is up, and we heard this earlier today with solar power, when there's a lot of solar, the price can be zero. But when there's no solar and no wind at all, the price can be really high. And we want to mitigate this by be able to use all the flexibility resources that we have available in the grid. So, moving on to the challenge. How can we use heat pumps in every house or an electric boat charger in this community and use that to provide balance to the power system? Because right now, the only people that are allowed to contribute to the balancing market are the large industry players or the coal-fired or gas-fired power plants. So if we want to make this work, if we want to make the solar and wind expansion work, we need to figure out how we can use all the available flexibility and not just the ones coming from large industry players or the power plants. So this is really the key problem. We can do flexibility and it works fine, but when we need more, we need to expand into all the available flexibility resources that we can find. But right now, what happens is that to participate in the balancing market, you need to come over a certain limit for the market provider to trust that you can do what you said you would. So how can we expand this trust from the big industry players down towards all the small-scale assets that we have in the power system? So I see this as two parts in this. One is what we in the power system call pre-qualification, to get approved to be a balancing player. This is something that we need to figure out in order to be able to use small-scale appliances. But the other problem is that whenever flexibility is provided, how can we make sure that the asset that we were told was going to do flexibility actually committed to the flexibility that they said? So this is okay if we have a few large industry players. We can check them and we can have a relationship with them to make everything work. But how can we do it if we want to use all the different appliances? So with that being said, I want to move into a sort of a little panel discussion with the people involved. So I think, Magnus, why don't you just introduce yourself really short, and then we can move into the discussion.
Yes, Magnus Berg, my name. I work for Vattenfall Corporate R&D. So the Corporate R&D department, positioned in Stockholm, but have a responsibility for the whole group, meaning the different countries where we're present, primarily Germany and here in the Netherlands and Sweden, but also other countries in Western Europe, and responsible for flexibility and decentralized assets, in short.
Hello, everybody. My name is Gadi Michaeli. I'm heading SolarEdge grid services activities globally. SolarEdge is known for its smart energy solutions, hardware products mostly, including PV inverters, optimizers, as well as recently electric vehicle chargers and energy storage. What's a bit less known is that SolarEdge also has solutions which are software-based solutions providing today flexibility into markets around the world. And I'll be happy to share more about it during this panel.
Good afternoon, also from my side. I'm Maximilian Fey from a development team within Vattenfall R&D. And we're developing a platform together with control and optimization systems and algorithms to operate flexibility of any kind and of any size. So we have done projects including assets like solar PV, batteries, EV chargers, also now heat pumps and district heating. And we do a local optimization, provide energy management solutions for them, but in the future also see ourselves as an aggregator and then want to provide ancillary services on top of that. And that's where the topic of flexibility verification comes into play.
Thank you very much. So Magnus, I went through really quickly now sort of what's the scope of flexibility and why it's necessary. How would you summarize that short, with your own words?
I think you gave a very good introduction to flexibility in a general sense, but perhaps you focused on the role of the frequency control, which is one area or one market and probably the most mature market for flexibility, but we need flexibility on other levels in the system as well. And I would like to stress that in the future there will not only be one market, frequency containment reserve, but there will be other markets towards the DSOs, and these markets are right now opening up. And the complexity from local optimization towards optimization for the DSO, and then the frequency control. And you want to do this basically at the same time, or use the same flexible assets one day or 1 hour towards one service and another time, another period to another service. I think that's summarize flexibility in a quick way.
And Gadi, you mentioned that SolarEdge is already looking into providing flexibility.
Yes, so SolarEdge identified the need for being able to control these kind of assets and provide additional value to the different types of stakeholders involved a couple of years ago. And if I can say, probably the most important building block of all is make sure that the hardware in the field is controllable. It doesn't have to be controllable or controlled the day one in which it is installed, but must be capable of being controlled. Later on, you can do many other things to expose this controllability and aggregate it and control it, even typically without almost any additional cost, any additional hardware. And this becomes a very strong tool because assets are being rolled out naturally, are being used for their main purpose, and then just became relevant and useful as markets mature, as regulation progress and allow these kind of aggregations to materialize, and so on. In some cases, like Magnus said, frequency-related use cases in some jurisdictions are more mature, but are also technologically more challenging. In other jurisdictions, typically the United States, the most basic use case is traditional demand response, where the actual flexibility is rather slow and known hours in advance, rather than needs to be acted upon autonomously on a second-by-second basis. So really, different markets need somewhat different solutions, but all of them demonstrate themselves eventually in grid frequency deviations. And
can you speak a little bit more about the aggregation platform that you have at SolarEdge?
Sure. So given that SolarEdge today has probably 1.4 or something similar million inverters deployed globally, all of these inverters are connected, meaning they provide reporting into a central management platform, which allows system owners and installers typically monitor and maintain effectively those systems. It's true for inverters, and I anticipate this must be the trend also for EV chargers, smart heat pumps, and anything else that will be deployed in the next few years that the ecosystem wants to be controlled. This same monitoring platform is used for maintenance, as I mentioned, on a day-to-day basis, but can also provide the controls over these assets remotely from the cloud, so that these assets really behave as a fleet. So a typical residential battery is capable of discharging 5 kilowatts, which is very small. 1,000 such batteries are like a small power plant. It's 5 megawatts. So it's starting getting interesting. Now in Germany, in Italy, Australia, the US, there are many, many countries where you see tens of thousands of these batteries are already installed. All of them in principle can be controlled. The market around these or in these countries are really what allow the assets to participate, sets the incentive levels, and so on.
Right. And Max, at Vattenfall, you're also developing a similar kind of solution, or?
Yeah, exactly. So far, we mainly do the main focus in our projects is the local optimization of the energy flows. So the most simple case would probably be a site where we have a PV system and a battery. We could increase our solar self-consumption, then we can do energy arbitrage, that is buying electricity when it's cheap and using it when it's, or potentially selling it when it's more expensive. And then maybe what is financially or economically most interesting is to do peak shaving, that especially is relevant if we have bigger consumers like commercial or industrial sites, where then from the distribution grid side, you usually have a tariff with demand charges, which set a price not only to the energy you consume, but also to the maximum power averaged over a certain time window that you consume. We heard it in the talk before here from Jan from Stedin, that based on the developments in the energy system with more and more electrification, we experience higher peaks, and these demand charges basically price those peaks. And if we can, by the operation of our batteries or heat pumps, cap these spikes or reduce them, we can reduce the bill. And so far our projects mainly have done this local optimization, but now the business case becomes really interesting, and also the use for the grid or society, when we can provide on top of that ancillary services. And for that, we want to pool our assets that we have. And
but so how do you verify that one of the assets that you control actually behaved in the way that you expected it to?
Yeah, I mean, I think that's exactly for us the key challenge here is that this local optimization, for example, the peak shaving, and then the demand from, for example, the grid or whoever demands this flexibility, they might coincide, so that with the operation of the asset, we are, like, if we just continue to driving it the way it's locally optimal, maybe it's also beneficial for the grid, but they also can be in contrast, so that maybe in the grid an upward regulation would be necessary, but locally it makes sense to reduce the consumption. So and here we would need this verification to actually see which part of this operation of the battery was due to a reaction to a demand from to kind of improve the grid, or if it was local.
Yeah, right. Magnus, you look like you want to fill in here.
For sure, I can fill in. No, I was more thinking when Gadi and Max presented the different platforms, and then a natural question is, of course, sort of, do we need these different platforms? And I'm basically sponsoring the work Max do, and then I invite Gadi to have a commercial competing platform. And why is that? But as I see it, we really need different kinds of platform in the future system, and these platforms are serving partly different purposes. When we have something like SolarEdge do that can steer millions of SolarEdge inverters, I mean, we need that, and that's the cheapest way to steer, and that's a way to have a lot of steering, for example, towards the frequency control, while there might be behind a meter at the customer appliances from a number of different suppliers. There might be a solar cell inverter from SolarEdge, and there might be a heat pump from someone totally else, and then you need a local optimization on top of that. So I think the platform that Max presented we really need when we have customers with different assets and bigger customers, but as soon as we have a customer with a number of different appliances, we need some kind of steering between these to optimize locally while selling a service towards grid or frequency control. Then you can do it easily with a platform, as Gadi explains. So for me, that's the difference between the platforms.
Well, so Gadi, in your platform, could you use any kind of inverter or even EV charger or stuff like that?
So that's a great question. We designed the system to support third-party hardware, and we start onboarding these kind of hardware as we speak. But I still see a need of multiple types of platforms, and the need for I don't believe in a world of a single platform, really. It can never exist, and it will not be sustainable, and it will not be competitive. So that's this will not happen. But just going back to your previous question, how do you verify that the asset really contributed what it should have? I really believe this is amongst the trickiest problems, because unlike traditional generators, which only generate, so if there is a single meter, it could be 1 meter for a huge power plant, it can be as expensive as you want, as accurate as you want, and you have to replace it with 1,000 or 1,000,000 meters. they cannot cost a million times the same cost of same meter. So the requirements from this type of meter, by definition, should be relaxed. And this relaxation process is very painful for all the involved parties. And not only that, it's also that even if it's, let's say somebody gave away 1 digit of accuracy in the metering capability and gave away sampling resolution down from, let's call it 0.01 hertz to 1 hertz. It's still that you measure typically at the grid connection point, and you're not measuring independently individual assets. So now it goes all the way back to the rules of the program to assure that the requirements are not set that high that nobody can meet them. Because if you have to meter, for example, every participating resource separately, like EV chargers separately, and batteries separately, and heat pumps separately, so you'll end up with 3 meters. So obviously it's not sustainable. Therefore, you see a lot of tension and discovery and pilots trying to figure out what's the right way to measure in a residential setting, for example, where you have both load and generation co-located, and how you would assign value to what's being contributed by the load. Like it's a, let's call it a battery program. Flexibility, which is based on battery programs. There are many of these in the US. In Australia, governments and local governments and federal governments are incentivizing everybody who's willing to buy batteries and participate in these kind of programs. But eventually it's very, very, then you have to measure the battery only when you measure for frequency contribution, because it's a battery program and they only are interested in the battery contribution. While in the real world, what would matter to the utility would be the grid connection point and what was the end result at that particular point. So this is whole an evolution in happening, and it's going to be interesting.
And with that, we want to open up for questions. Yeah, exactly. You are first out. Yes, very good timing. Wait, there's a mic coming in.
Oh. Thank you. You are making the statement that there will never be a single platform. And what do you exactly mean with that? And why can't there be a single platform, in your opinion?
Maybe never is a strong word, it's an opinion.
Yeah, I understand.
I'm just thinking that a single platform, in the sense that a single vendor will be that dominant that everything will be set by that vendor's protocols, let's say, is not something I see happening.
Okay.
I think there could be shared, for example, standards which dictate or facilitate everybody participating in the same way, and then relying on multiple, for example, aggregators, each of which will have its own, like there could be a Vattenfall aggregation and other players' aggregations, all of which could participate in these markets, and it will be multiple platforms participating, not a single platform. That's what I meant. Does make sense?
So what you mean is let's say what you have in the big tech market with the dominance of Google, Microsoft, and so on. You can never allow one of these companies to be dominant on, or maybe a metering company or whatever. But what you could have is a single platform that has an open structure on which people could collaborate.
Yes, and typically for individuals to collaborate in this kind of platform, I think there is still a way to go together. Near term, I anticipate more to see a small number of aggregators participating, and potentially in an evolution, smaller and smaller groups could participate directly. But in terms of economics, from my experience, there are so many barriers to pass that there is still a long way until you can just subscribe into a platform and start trading.
But theoretically, you could do that if you have a system that verifies the flexibility, right? You could participate on your own, and you wouldn't need the platform.
Yeah, that's also a matter of market structure, of course, because the market is at the moment is structured that you need to be large to be a part of, to be a player. And for small players, there's the entry barriers are just too big.
It's very common to see 100 kilowatts, for example, as a minimum entry point for participation, or maybe megawatt in some markets.
Okay.
And most small homes are.
No, I don't do megawatts. No.
Should we? Do we have another?
We don't consume megawatts. So.
Do we have another question? Yes, up here in front.
You mentioned a couple of times local optimization, but I was wondering whether you're hinting upon local balancing, because in my opinion, you can seek local balancing, but you can also aggravate with that the national balancing, so they can go actually in opposite direction. Or did you mean with local optimization something totally else?
Yeah, when I mentioned it, I rather meant optimizing the energy flows of the local energy system. So, like of a site you have, in order to like peak shave, reduce your energy bill. Nothing with balancing.
Because I still have a question. I mean, I understand that verification is very important. But I still don't understand why verification is the mere problem for balancing the grid.
I think the protocol we're looking here for is mainly to reduce the entry barriers to provide balancing services, because as we heard right now, you need to be you have certain capacity requirements, like 100 kilowatt or megawatt. To enter this market, you need to pass very administrative heavy pre-qualification procedures from the TSO. And on the TSO level, there's not even a balancing market so far. So we envision that with such a protocol, we could lower the entry barriers also for smaller aggregators or even individual players to contribute in such a balancing market, however it might look like.
Isn't it the case that this is where the role of the aggregator comes in, because it is a market, it's a design flow, not a flow, but it was meant in order to ensure reliability and balancing of the market, and that's why we have those minimum thresholds, and that's where the role of the aggregator comes into play. But so is it the case that we're trying to think of the role of the aggregator and how can he aggregate flexibility and ensure reliability of dispatching to enable balancing while adhering to all the minimum thresholds of the market design? Or are we trying to redesign an entire market, entry barriers and the minimum thresholds?
I think it's an extremely relevant question. For me, as I see it, it's probably sort of a two-step procedure. I mean, the markets in Europe are opening up more and more for third-party aggregators, independent of the power companies, independent of the balance responsible party. And I mean, that's the first step being taken right now. And as I see it, I mean, the next step that you can think of is, of course, that you don't need the aggregator, that the private customer sells his consumption without this middle hand, which also an independent aggregator is. So I do think short term, yes, we need aggregators. We see us as an aggregator, but also there will be independent aggregators, and that's the first step.
Yeah, let's move on. Another question.
I was wondering, what is your strategy with respect to communication? Because when you do want to unlock this flexibility, you need to be able to communicate with that. Also with that end user, and if you have a dedicated communication, well, that's difficult to establish. And if you let it go over the internet, and some kind of state actor could break in to the device and switch off the light. So, what is your strategy with respect to communication and with securing that communication?
I guess Gadi is the appropriate, since you have a system working like that.
So in principle, the communication obviously is crucial and is a vulnerability point where.
As an Israeli, you must have thought.
Yes, true. But in practicality, I think we can divide the problem into two parts. The individual consumer could be affected, but the overall systematic damage if an individual customer is hacked is very limited. Definitely inconvenient and has to be enforced as stringently as possible to prevent it, but limited. There are other vulnerabilities which are if the aggregation platform will be intruded or hacked, what the damage then is being multiplied to the number of underlying assets. Communication, dedicated communication is an approach I saw in Germany, but nowhere else in the world, specifically in the context of frequency containment reserve services. I don't believe this is the right trajectory. I think secure internet protocols is probably the only viable long-term solution, or similar. It doesn't have to be this, but something along the line of widely tested, reasonably secured at the part between the individual assets and the aggregation platform. And the aggregation platform itself and upwards has to be very, very strongly secured.
Do we have another question? Oh.
Thank you. My name is Daan Schreuder, and I was wondering, it's a little bit a technical question, but do you need a completely understanding of the grid to get some, to make the right choices to do optimization? Something like a digital twinner. Where are the bottlenecks? Which information do you need?
Not sure if I understood the question, but where is the bottleneck in the system? For me, there's not one bottleneck. There's so many different bottlenecks. If you need to understand, I mean, someone needs to understand this, and we want to support with new flexible assets, more flexible assets towards the local grid company, towards the TSO. Where are the bottlenecks? Well, that can be very geographically specified by the DSO, but it's also a bottleneck that the whole European system needs a frequency that is stable enough. So there's so many different bottlenecks, and as I started to say, very different markets that you could sell your flexibility towards. Was it an answer?
I'm wondering if it's possible to do this locally, because you need, I think, understand how the grid works.
I would just want to add that the more you know about the network, it's better, but it's not a condition. Typically, the market or the system needs to provide those signals inherently. So either it's going to be via price, or it's going to be, if you have to design the assets to deploy the asset in a specific region because of anticipated bottleneck in a specific network part. So this is known in advance, and there are all kinds of programs. I'm mostly familiar with these kind of problems in the US, really, where there is incentive paid for long-term contracts for generators to deploy assets in a specific region. So it's called capacity auctions. You have it in northeast of the US, for example, and you can commit to install a generation capability, which also meets everything else, such as has to be green, for example, and it should be able to provide X megawatts for the next decade, starting at a point in time. So this requires some understanding of the network, but other than that, you don't, and typically cannot have this kind of visibility at the service provider's level.
Nice. I think we had another question up here in front.
10 minutes left.
Great.
Hello, Wilhelmo. It sounded like it was more like demand-side response. Is it a data problem? Is it more a storage problem, a communication problem, or a management problem? What's the most important part about this challenge? Well, where lies the biggest value where we should apply the fix first?
Trust.
Yeah, it's like I guess you're into the same thing. Right now, the market provider has trust in the assets providing flexibility because there are only a few and they are monitored quite strictly. But how can we extend that trust into the small scale?
No, I agree. I mean, large scale, we have trust, the system has trust, the market have trust, but to supply this from a single car charging or a single PV inverter for a solar cell, then we need trust in the individual or trust in the company that supplied that inverter. So trust, I think, is what we want to solve in this challenge, and that is a need for all the distributed millions and millions of small assets that will supply the demand side management. It is about demand side management, absolutely, but much smaller than any one of us has been used to work with, really.
We have another question again here.
Well, it's not a question, but it's a remark. So
Oh,
I'm not
great.
sure if it's allowed.
I love those, yes.
Is that allowed?
Yes.
I'm a mathematician, and if you talk about connecting many small players, then the big numbers are going to work for you. So then you have to worry less about trust, and you have the central limit theorem or so. So why do you still worry about trust?
Well, one thing is that it's money involved, and basically, I mean, the customer that is flexible want to be paid somehow, reduced cost or paid, and anything that has with money to do needs trust.
Also, as a mathematician, you know that there is still a chance of catastrophic failure, even if it's a very long tail of the distribution, right? So you are not people typically are not willing to have this happen. So, and this is like the whole system is built with redundancy, but you're right. I mean, the fact that you have a million contributing resources just rather than just a single generator or a few large generators does provide some.
You get an average case.
But Max, you were saying before when we spoke, talking about that someone could use a system like it or an aggregator or someone to sort of steal electricity.
Yeah, for example, let's imagine that not like any aggregator has, for example, now an agreement with a local system operator. The local system operator gives a demand for a regulation of the electricity usage, and then they could react to it and get remunerated. And that system might be built on trust. But now, if we open up that system to like many different actors, maybe you could like just put a box with an algorithm or something between your measurement and the signal you're sending out, and like fake the signal and kind of steal the remuneration that you then get for flexibility that you have not provided actually. So we want like you have to have some verification that this flexibility that you say you provide was actually provided.
Question here.
I still have a question as a follow-up on my colleague there, because I understand that trust is important, but where does the problem lie now? Is it on the data layer, so the fact that there is little data being communicated, or on the communication layer that currently we cannot communicate as fast as we would like to, or on the design market layer that we have to optimize for so many different conditions, from the physical characteristics of the asset that I can dispatch to the different market design like sustain time, bidding time, opening gates? Where does the problem sit on those different layers? I understand that trust is core, but there's so many layers still.
Like I'm no expert in that field, but I understand it as in the communication layer, like communicating from the site to the market place. Yeah.
One typical problem is that you don't get the data at the frequency you need it. Intervals are longer than you would like them to be, because it's in some cases prohibitively expensive to give it to you like every second or less. And for frequency containment reserve and this kind of flexibility, this is the velocity of data ideally you'd like to have, so you'll be able to respond if something is not behaving as planned. Because planned should be things behave autonomously and you don't even rely on communication in order to provide the balancing at this kind of speeds. But in practicality, if somebody downloaded malware into all resources, instead of positive contributions, they provide negative contribution, the sooner you know about it, the better, right? Because your grid is going in the opposite directions, and the balancing effect should contribute to it. So these kind of things are important, and it's a real-world problem. I think the quality of the data itself is less of a problem. It's really the security of, like cyber security overall, and the availability of near real-time data from as many assets as possible, which relates also to the metering challenge we discussed earlier, and so on.
Do we have a final question? Yes, up here in front.
I would propose a slightly more philosophical final question, referring to the keynote speech this morning, where we learned that the problem isn't solved with the same thinking as that created it, according to Einstein, and that Darwin was actually wrong in saying it's competition. Cooperation is more key. So, as a modest investor and independent entrepreneur, I would be interested to sponsor some form of creating something that is based on cooperation rather than competition, where someone can win. If you look at it as a market, and I think we have created far too many markets that are weaving around nowadays, with the risk that bots will be the strongest eventually and always win, as we see in cryptocurrency markets and in stock markets. I wouldn't like to see that happening in energy markets as well. So if we are solving a problem, I would like to, sponsor something that is working on cooperation rather than that someone wins and someone else loses in this. So what's your opinion on that?
I can perhaps start a little bit and you guys can fill in, because we had a quite interesting discussion during lunch about this. Because if you have a system that can sort of verify on an asset level that some kind of flexibility was provided, you could theoretically make that verification also distributed and move out the market operator. And because you can measure frequency, the indication of balance, you can measure that in any plug around your power system. You could theoretically have all appliances being set on providing the little bit of flexibility that you need at any given moment of time. So you could create a sort of a community-supported balance system, if you will, in that sense, if you have a verification process. At least that's sort of my take on it, but please fill in. Magnus?
No, I think what you, Axel, says is visionary. I mean, that's a long-term vision. Looking more short-term, I mean, today we have an energy market. It's an existing market, and with a lot of different marketplaces on different levels. And what this facilitates is opening up for many more and smaller players down to individual households, basically, to contribute. So, I mean, that is to make it more open in that sense, still towards some kind of existing market, yes.
I'm going to stop there and just continue to the last pages of the presentation and wrap this up. So, really interesting discussion. What we will bring to the hackathon is the availability to connect to an EV charger or a solar inverter to try to test the system out. And we've been speaking a lot of technical terms here today. So what we will also bring are people that have knowledge about all the technical sides of things from an energy point of view, so that you guys can work more specifically on the system design or get the knowledge that or the competence that you need. So, and yeah, after the hackathon, of course, yes, okay. We've been talking a lot about this, it's really important. If you manage to design a really interesting solution, there is a lot of opportunities to follow up with that at Vattenfall and in our headquarters in Stockholm. But with that, thank you very much, and thank you for listening.